end, probably by the next slide. Imagine you were going to design a game system, or government. You can get out of the games if you want, or I tend to use games because we have things that, even lifelike games, we try to mimic life and have second lives and things like that. But if you were going to design it, do you design it with the best interests of the participants in mind? Is your goal to make a system that is profitable for you, and note that profitability may be a direct result of making a system that is beneficial for players? Is your goal to make a system that you participate in, or is it a system for other people to participate in? Are you a member of the player set, or are you an external authority deciding what the players can do? How do you determine the core values that will serve as a foundation for this system? What consideration are you going to give to the interests of each individual that's going to be a participant? In secular systems, the source of the core values is internal to the system. It's predicated on the views, both rational and emotional. We're not saying anything about discouraging anybody's feelings. One of the third question I got was, what about love? This all sounds rational, but what about love? You're just discounting emotion. No, we're not. We're just saying that the source of the core values are internal to the system, which means I can have as a value, if I want to justify it, the fact that I'm going to treat her better than somebody else because I have an emotional attachment to her. That's Beth, by the way. In non-secular systems, the source is external to the system. There's no direct link, no necessary direct link between the values and the players. By external, we might mean external in a transcendent sense, as many religions adopt, this idea of some governing God figure that is outside the system, imposing its moral views on the players within. Also outside the system, we might talk about in an above-the-law sense, as you might have in a dictatorship, where you have this individual who's imposing the rules on everybody else, but it's a real person, and he just is above the law and doesn't have to play by those rules. And also in the no longer applicable sense, it is outside the system. Some ancient person, a human being who actually existed, came up with a bunch of rules, and some people adopted them because they seemed good at the time, and now they stick with them, even though the individual who came up with them is no longer able to participate in the creation and modification of those values. It's true that we might wind up being happy if somebody else picks your career or your mate or your, I don't even know if somebody can pick your values for you. The idea that somebody else can impose those things isn't always bad. We see this, in the parent-child dynamic, where the parent has information and they're going to make some decisions on behalf of their child, and those decisions are in their best interest generally. But that's not the same as deciding what somebody else's values are. The point is that external systems aren't necessarily evil or bad, or not even in your best interest. It's just that there's no guarantee that you are able to participate in the creation of those core values and the decisions that get made in that process. One path, the secular path, allows us the freedom to change and seek happiness on some other path if we find out things aren't working out. Whose interests are served? Like I said, you're going to see a trend right off the bat. Secular systems serve the interests of those inside the system. That's where we got the core values from. These are the individuals that we are interested in. We are not trying to benefit the external source or any external source at all. It is all internal. Non-secular systems may or may not serve the interests of the players within. There's no guarantee. There may be a claim that they're working in the best interest of the players, but they ultimately conform to some external opinion of what is in the best interest of the players. Was it any consolation at all to hear a parent say, "I'm doing this for your own good"? They may have been, and they may have been right. They weren't always right. There's no guarantee they're always going to be right. And they're not always going to be actually acting in your best interest. What they're actually doing is acting in what they perceive your best interest to be. And in the parent-child dynamic, that's generally okay, because we have this responsibility of passing on the information we gain and protecting our young and helping them to build up the tool set they need to make these decisions on their own in the future. The Secular systems rely on internal authority for those values, goals, and enforcement. They're self-organized, modified, and enforced. Non-secular systems rely on external authorities for each of these. One key point to note is the internal authorities are accepted, while the external authorities are imposed. The issue isn't one of whether or not the ultimate source of an external imposed system exists or not. I couldn't care less whether or not the external source actually exists. What we're assessing here is both the values that come from that source and the system that is those values predicate. As I've noted before, I don't believe that the biblical God exists. I know that's going to come as a surprise to everyone here. But if it does, that doesn't mean that its views are right. It doesn't mean that I have to consider its views to be correct. It doesn't mean that I have to recognize its authority. It may be the case, as we've seen many times in many countries where people are oppressed, that the correct moral action would be to resist any such might makes right authority, which is exactly what you get with the non-secular top-down, there's a God dictating what your values should be. And the easiest single question I ever came up with to address this happened after a lecture. When people try to assert that, well, okay, I can shrug off this God thing, but I'm telling you he's real, and someday you're going to have to pay. And I just asked, if you got a bill for a service that you never signed up for, would you pay it? I wouldn't. There has to be some demonstration of authority. There has to be some demonstration of, you owe us why. There has to be a, I am your authority because. And if the answer is only one of might makes right, there is nothing at all moral about that. It is morally ambivalent. It has no bearing on whether or not the positions being imposed have any moral value. Might makes right doesn't do anything. I mean, you run around beating people with a stick and say, I'm right. Nobody's going to be convinced you're right. They may pretend to agree with you long enough to avoid being hit, but that's just about it. Secular moral systems are not simply fiat declarations. Their authority comes from the participants by agreement and are justified by the fact that it works. When it comes to the modification and alteration of the systems, like I said, there's a big trend here. Secular systems are internal, dynamic, and encourage change. The system not only permits change and encourages change, and secular moral systems have as a primary goal the best interests of the participants. If that's your primary goal, and you discover that the secondary goals you put in place are conflicting with that goal, then you've identified a problem. And as the participants or the architects of the system, they're free, if not actually obligated, to make changes. This hierarchical system builds upon not only the primary goals, but on the information we gain from the application of this system. And I'll touch on this more in a minute when we start talking about what kind of core values one might engage in and compare, but there's going to be a conflict at some point. There's no perfect, there's no one-size-fits-all answer for every possible scenario and situation. And so how your moral system deals with those complex situations and how your moral system works to enact change is critical. And in a secular system, change is encouraged. It's the reason we have, I would say, any progress at all on this front. The change is based on new information. Hey, look, this group doesn't like being second-class citizens, and this is causing conflict in the system. Maybe our predetermined value over here that males are better than females or whites are better than blacks, this thing that we held up on high as a value, maybe it's wrong, and so we change it. But if it's written in stone, you can't. Chess is a great game, which is one of the reasons why I keep referencing it over and over again. But what if we found out that there was a way to improve it? What if we had house rules, or just altered them altogether? We have house rules for lots of other games, I'm sure, especially parents with kids. You're not going to necessarily throw a kid into a board game that's way over their head without assistance. Or I'll show you my hand, and let me help you play this. That's more instructive, but we change the rules of games all the time. Flag football is an extension of tackle football, and every new game is probably a modification of some old game or fundamental principle. As long as we're in agreement on what the new rules are, everything's fair. We can change the rules as we discover problems, And if we were to solve chess and determine that the game is imbalanced, that in other words, with perfect play, one side can always force a win, it may be in our best interest to change the rules. As it stands now, I don't see too many chess groups changing the rules of chess. It's withstood the test of time, but as computing power increases, we might find out that there's a serious problem in the game, at which point it'll lose some of its appeal in much the way that tic-tac-toe has lost appeal. Balance isn't always the goal. Tic-tac-toe is about as balanced as you can get. That's the reason why nobody plays it. At least, after a period or so. Secular moral systems don't just allow us to change the game. They allow us to change with the game. Because we live in a dynamic world that is constantly changing, and we are constantly facing new situations. The big benefit is that we have our past experience and these other situations where we've already solved the problems, or at least come up with a resolution that's satisfying. We can use those to apply to new situations. Non-secular systems don't normally permit change, or if they do, those changes come from an external source. You get a New Testament type thing, or new prophets, or some seeing stones that tell you more about when Jesus was hiding away with the Indians in the United States. They're generally rigid, non-secular systems, and if there are any changes, they still may not consider the best interests of the participants. When you see a non-secular, when you see religious moral system change, it's often because it's been forced to from outside, and it still may not be the right change. As a matter of fact, usually they'll half-step. In some cases, those half-steps make things worse. Don't ask for examples, it's horrific. But the static or sluggish nature of non-secular moral systems ensures that they are constantly in danger of having the world pass them by. That is the only thing that drives change in a religious system. The fear of obsolescence, which I would say is probably my goal. So, and when I talk about conflict resolution here, I don't know if it was necessarily clear from the slide alone. I'm not talking about how do we end war or anything. I'm talking about within an individual moral system, there are conflicts that are in our eyes. How do you deal with them? And again, we're back at the same trend. What happens when one system finds itself in conflict with another moral system, or with itself, or when one or more of these systems needs to change? What method is used to resolve the conflicts? Secular systems tend to be data and results driven. They tend to rely on debate, discussion, and the evaluation of evidence. These are the ideals. Obviously, we don't always live up to these ideals. We're all imperfect, and we can't always rely on others to be convinced by reason and evidence. And so I don't think for a minute that I'm advocating an entirely pacifist position where, oh, well, we can't work it out with these religious folks, so we'll just let them run right over it, because that's just not what I do. Generally speaking, though, secular systems are inclusive and participatory. And the more people who willingly adopt secular systems, the easier it becomes to resolve conflicts, because now you're dealing with more and more people in turn. Critical thinking skills, skepticism, and reasoning may be the greatest things we can ever teach another person. Non-secular systems rely on coercion or conversion. Conversion attempts to, or often purports to rely on evidence, but they aren't tied to the evidence, and they'll resort to emotional appeals or force when the evidence doesn't support the system. Generally speaking, they're divisive. It is, you are necessarily a part of our little system, or you're not, in which case you are absolutely wrong and have nothing to benefit us, because we're not interested in change. And one of the key differences, because somebody says, well, secular moral systems are just like that. You've got your secular moral system, and you're saying, you're not part of us, and you're wrong, and nothing you have is a benefit. That's not what I say at all. I say, you're welcome to join us. You may have some things to add that may be beneficial. But right now, you're really freaking wrong, and we can talk about how to change it. But you're the one that's unwilling to change. You, in the non-secular, the religious moral system, are the one that are holding up this rigid line that's being divisive. And we're saying, hey, you can come over here. And by the way, the come over here thing is when you're going to the religion, you actually have to go over there. When religions come to the secular, it's kind of, it widens the gap between both of them. We all benefit. We can all learn things. It would be absurd to think that after that,